Hey there! This video is just going to be a quick recap of our last session of Age of Rebellion Star Wars. And it's not going to be up to the same polished standard that you might expect here on the channel. It is going to be somewhat edited, and of course I am talking into my microphone doing a voiceover. But the reason that I'm doing it is because unfortunately the live recording that was of our session got a bit bungled, and I want to make sure to preserve a lot of the details, including a number of the very interesting moments where the Star Wars narrative dice system came to light and really grabbed the camera and enriched the session. So without further ado, let's begin by describing the circumstances that began the combat and the session. After a long sojourn away from the Five Sisters, our heroes have returned. The Five Sisters are the planets at the epicenter of our campaign of Age of Rebellion. The Empire has come down hard upon a tradition of Force users and the native inhabitants of these planets, because the Shepherds, as they are called, they might become a source of training in the light side of the Force for that intrepid pilot who just destroyed the Death Star over the planet Yavin. But enough about him. This story is the tale of Davian, a law enforcement officer from the Five Sisters. When the Imperial legions descended, he made a choice to air with the rebellion. His droid companion 1v4N has been along for the ride and has had some flashes of brilliance as a heroic pilot, is knowledgeable in some of the weedier, darker places of the Empire, and at one point in his past, 1v4N was apparently owned by some Hutts and was privy to a number of their criminal dealings. Maxbil is something of a provincial engineer. He's spent a good deal of his adult life working on the Tabana gas platforms here on Scintilla. As is so often the case in Star Wars, the day that he decided to follow his destiny and try and steal a spacecraft off-world, he found himself stealing the same spacecraft that 1v4N and Davian wanted to use to escape an Imperial squadron of stormtroopers. So that's how the campaign began, and now we're in the middle of the campaign. There's been a number of narrow escapes, sabotages, successful missions, hijinks involving Hutts, stormtroopers, TIE fighters, hyperspace, strange planets, and even stranger creatures. The crew acquired the Far Horizon, one of those sleek-lined HWK-branded vessels from an unfortunate Hutt, and it has become their new home. On a recent adventure, the crew also gained a new companion, Froyn, who's a card-sharking ne'er-do-well. We don't know much about him yet, besides that much. And this is their very first bona fide mission in the formal service to the Alliance to restore the Republic. They've heard tell that the Empire is moving people off-world by the tens of thousands, and perhaps there's a way to disrupt that movement of people. They witness shellcrafts full of people flowing up from the surface of Scintilla to the asteroid moon, the Watcher, where they were loaded aboard Clone Wars-era acclimator troop transports for parts unknown. The Far Horizon descends through the pink clouds to an island called Leto Reef near Scintilla's equator. Here, it lands at a compound where the Empire has invited bounty hunters to serve them in rounding up dissidents and escapees that have descended into the depths of Scintilla's atmosphere. For Scintilla is possessed of much more air than Earth or a planet like it. There are seas of Soupy Air where trees and creatures float on wings of gossamer. And these murky, foggy seas, choked with spores and strange creatures, have become the quagmire. They are like the jungle of Vietnam or the mountain of Afghanistan. And thus Scintilla's depths are the nurturing and sheltering terrain in which an insurgency that might see the Five Sisters join the Alliance to restore the Republic. The Far Horizon has only just landed. Davian and Maxbil are presenting their bounty-hunting guild credentials, falsified, of course, to an Imperial lieutenant who gesticulates to a bounty board of wanted suspects and the rewards associated with them. Outside of this command tent, 1v4N and Froyn are attempting to skylark with some stormtroopers who are midway through cleaning their gear and checking their weapons for full function. At this moment, a Sentinel-class landing craft descends and lands near the command tent. Its rear hatchway opens, and a droid complains to two stormtrooper guards who were within that the bloody mess in the passenger compartment needs to be cleaned up. The stormtroopers begin to seek someone from the pit crew or a local to hose out the back of this Sentinel-class landing craft. Evidently, perhaps it was carrying prisoners that bounty hunters had been rounding up. At this moment, as the stormtroopers turn their back, a woman who is in a spider hold somewhere near the hatchway of the Sentinel drops to the floor, runs down the gangplank, and attempts to make a break for a cliffside that yawns into Scintilla's foggy depths. At this point, Things matter moment by moment enough that I decide that it's time to ask for initiative. For 1v4N and Froyn, this is a cool roll inside of the tent. For Davian and Maxbil, unaware of what's going on outside, this is a vigilance roll, and so too it is for the Imperial Lieutenant. The Imperial Lieutenant has the adversary talent and upgrades the difficulty, since this is sort of a one-on-one situation, of Davian and Maxbil's initiative rolls. Furthermore, I gave a setback die to everyone inside of the tent for their initiative to represent the delay and the imperfect information. Nevertheless, Davian and Maxbil rolled advantages, although relatively low on their success total, which meant that they had a good picture of what was going on outside the tent. Meanwhile, Froyn continued his charming conversation with the stormtroopers, whose backs were to the Sentinel-class shuttlecraft. He very purposefully departed the stockade and moved towards the shuttlecraft, as if he belonged there, and his charm offensive was almost successful. However, he rolled a despair, and one of the stormtroopers was very suspicious that Froyn might not be who he said he was, in more ways than one. This suspicion lingered and brewed within him, and on the immediate next turn, as a lone minion, not the minion group, just one stormtrooper, with no upgrades to his ranged heavy pool, laid into, with his blaster, Froyn, who's possessed by a suspicious notion, and Froyn was struck by a blaster bolt, but so too was a pneumatic piston on the Sentinel's landing ramp. So a gout of steam cloaked Froyn as he choked his way into the interior of the Sentinel and covered himself from enemy fire. Meanwhile, 1v4N made a break after the escaping woman from the shuttlecraft, and actually fired his blaster carbine wildly in the air. He wanted everyone to think that he was a bounty hunter, and he was going to take this woman down, and meanwhile he might obstruct the successful conduct of fire against this woman. The two nearer stormtroopers, after all, were firing on her with their blaster rifles set to stun. And here is where things took a very interesting turn. I upgraded 1v4N's dice pool using Destiny. After all, this was a pretty audacious move. It's the sort of thing that could shape the combat one way or another. It's the sort of action which we see C-3PO and Jar Jar Binks occasionally take, kind of inserting comedy and hijinks in a way that can make it difficult for more sober entities in a combat to do sinister things. What I mean to say by that is that the dark side of the Force had something to say about 1v4N, and indeed, when the dice pool was rolled, there was a despair. And narrating that despair, I decided that one of 1v4N's stray blaster bolts from his carbine struck one of the nearer stormtroopers near the shuttlecraft, right in the eyepiece of his helmet. The stormtrooper was killed instantly. At least for 1v4N, there was no longer much hope that the heroes would be able to maintain their cover identity. Next, inside the tent, Davian and Maxbil caught wind of what was going on outside. There was a quick moment where they were eye to eye with the lieutenant, but they had the drop on him. Davian pulled out his blaster and shot the lieutenant on stun. Unfortunately, this blow was not telling, and the lieutenant stumbled backward, muttering, "You shot me," in surprise. Maxbil drew his Slugthrower pistol and also fired a loud report into the lieutenant, who continued to stagger and curse. He was dazed by the loud blast of the ancient weapon. The lieutenant then tried to command his forces, pulling out his comlink. There was static all over the reception from whoever was hearing what he was trying to say, and it was merely gibberish, as he failed his leadership role to raise the alarm and to call help to himself. The initiative then rotated back around to the top, and I made a second roll for the lieutenant, because in Star Wars you get to pick who goes if it's one of your side's turns in the initiative order. This roll also failed. It was around this time that the woman absconding from the Sentinel-class landing craft, probably a native of Scintilla, garbed in some of what the characters can recognize as what the shepherds wear in their day-to-day lives of tribal subsistence. It was at about this time that she reached the cliffside. Between 1v4N and Froyn's actions, the stormtroopers were pretty distracted, and so as she readied herself to go over the precipice, she was able to concentrate fully, and she spread out her arms in a swan dive into the murky depths of Scintilla's atmosphere. Neither the heroes nor I know precisely what will become of her. While the lieutenant did fail his second leadership task, he did roll some advantages, which I gave him in the form of being able to make a maneuver to leave the tent. He stumbled out, and it was at this time that the stormtrooper minion group, the fellows who were cleaning their weapons within the stockade, one of them had just fired off a hail of blaster bolts at Froyn. They turned and saw their commanding officer, wounded, stumbling from the command tent. They ran and formed a logger around him to defend him. They were going to try and get him to an aid station and save his life. However, within the tent, Maxbil saw that the stormtroopers who had just finished cleaning their weapons and had just been working on their blaster rifles, well, they were working at a small folding table, and at this table, their power cells were recharging, all plugged into a small pocket fusion generator, that sort of glowing entity that Luke Skywalker used to keep warm and charge up his good friend R2-D2 in the murky depths of Dagobah. Well, it turns out that when you shoot one of those, it just so happens that they tend to explode. Maxbil rolled 2 triumphs on his ranged light roll, and using those 2 triumphs, it was pretty much within bounds to narrate that the microfusion generator exploded spectacularly in a little nova that consumed and killed, perhaps from the radiation as much as from the heat wave, the 3 stormtroopers and the lieutenant. The blast barely, because this is Star Wars, barely misses Davian and Maxbil inside of the tent. The droid pilot, who was stumbling away from his Sentinel landing craft, loses a good deal of his sanity and decides to make the best of things by stumbling off. Meanwhile, a raid siren, a full alert, is called for the post. All the bounty hunters walk out of the cantina and out of their lodgings. The stormtroopers who were not on duty across the runway begin to issue forth from their barracks. The explosion of the microfusion generator has been interpreted as an attack by rebel starfighters, perhaps. Somewhere elsewhere on Leto Reef, TIE fighters are scrambling, and their groan can be heard clawing their way towards the incident. Over the comlinks, Froyn, Maxbil, 1v4N, and Davian collect themselves. They realize that they're going to need to get away, and get away fast. 1v4N contemplates stealing a souped-up and beautiful-looking bounty hunter's starfighter, but it's equipped with some security systems. And unfortunately, he finds himself back aboard the Far Horizon in the company of Davian. Froyn and Maxbil take off in the Sentinel landing craft, which has a somewhat characterful cockpit. It's been decorated by its droid inhabitant with a number of fellow crew members that are more like imaginary friends made of paper. A flight engineer, a navigator, a gunner, made of paper. It might have a little bit to do with that droid pilot being the same eccentric make and model as 1v4N. Maybe. We'll find out more about what happens to the heroes aboard the Far Horizon and their newly acquired troop transport as they flee from what is certainly the full wrath of the Empire in the next installment of our game of the Five Sisters Revolt.